Oh, oh. We'd like to, yes, we'd like to say good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Adoption Happy Hour, brought to you by the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, aka NAAP, where it is their mission to bring unity to our community by elevating the diverse voices of the Adoption Coalition. Constellation. Bob can read. I'm Bob Brader. My pronouns are he, him.
And I'm Suzanne Bachner. My pronouns are she, her. And we're thrilled and honored to be the first ever guest host for the NAAP Adoption Happy Hour. We have enjoyed a wonderful history of firsts with NAAP. We attended the first ever conference, brought my play, The Good Adoptee, to make its Indiana debut at the second, and shared it virtually as part of NAAP's launch this past January. You can learn more about us in the chat. If I can make that happen, I'm going to try.
Like we said, it's great to be here tonight, along with Beth Story, helping out in the Zoom room. If you're joining us for the very first time tonight, please let us know in the chat, and also let us know where you're from. Are there any board members here?
Barbara Robertson, we already saw hello to, but let's say hi again.
Hi, Barbara.
And I know you're raising a hand there.
As you're driving.
As you're driving.
Yes.
Are there any other board members here? I don't think so. I don't think so. No. What?
Marcy.
Well, Marcy.
Of course.
Marcy Keepley.
All right, so.
We wanted to share a little bit about NAAP before we introduce our spotlight guest. I'm
going to get every slide but the right one.
There we go. Okay.
So NAAP stands for National Association of Adoptees and Parents.
NAAP has an annual conference that is absolutely fantastic, and I believe sold out for September in Indianapolis, Indiana. We have had the pleasure of going to this conference many times, and it is really wonderful. NAAP also hosts virtual support and networking groups, and offers a wealth of resources to the constellation. You can find so much stuff on naapunited.org.
And that will also be in the
This is
chat.
A sneak peek. Don't look.
Yes.
Don't look. It's a sneak peek of next week.
And also, we want to welcome everyone again and just say, please remain muted and raise your hand on the screen to be recognized, and post questions and comments in the chat. We will get to them all as soon as we can. And a really important thing that is very important to us is if you are experiencing a serious mental health event or suicidal thoughts, please contact a licensed professional or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And the numbers here, it's really very important.
And also, this is a public meeting with no guarantee that information or identity is confidential. Portions of this event are recorded and shared on NAAP's YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Great. So, at this time,
we'd like to introduce our spotlight guest for the evening. We're so excited. We had the honor of meeting Evy Yeager when we were working with one of our partner organizations on Bob's shows, Spitting in the Face of the Devil and Smoker, which tackle surviving child abuse and addiction. And Evy joined our talkbacks for 2 years in a row and brought a wealth of insight and resources to the table, and always knows how to share that. She became our theater company's resident trauma expert, and we love working with her and making connections that we would not have done without her. So we're so excited she's here tonight.
Evy Yeager, pronouns they, them, is an advocate, writer, and educator on the topics of trauma, recovery, and resilience. They are the founder and director of TraumaRoot, a small business dedicated to preventing and responding to trauma. TraumaRoot's mission is to support individuals and groups in developing a functional understanding of trauma and in facilitating recovery and resilience for themselves and others. Through training and counseling, TraumaRoot aims to make trauma education more affirming, accessible, and actionable. Evy believes that mental health education should be radically accessible to everyone in plain language that creates opportunity to talk about difficult things together, to find solidarity and support. You can learn more about Evy and their work at TraumaRoot.com. It is our great pleasure to introduce Evy Yeager.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and that was such a lovely introduction. I just want to correct one thing. I'm not counseling, just consulting. I'm not a counselor or a therapist, just to clarify. If you can hear me well and see my screen, just give me a little wave or a thumbs up so I know we're good to go. Okay, great. So thank you again, Suzanne and Bob, Marcy and Beth, and thanks to all of you for joining us to discuss trauma recovery and resilience. I'll do my best to make this a valuable experience and respect your time. Oh boy, okay. So after the workshop, I will share these slides with you, as well as a resource guide for further learning and action. Any references that I mentioned in the presentation will be included there. I welcome your questions and comments any way you want to share them. So take yourself off mute, type them in the chat, or message me directly if you prefer to stay anonymous. If I say something that's confusing or unclear and you need me to clarify before we keep going, then please jump in and interrupt me so I can address it. But if you have a question that maybe takes us down a different path, I just ask that you please hold on to it until the Q&A at the end. The language we use to talk about trauma is really diverse and changing all the time, and that's a good thing. Trauma and healing are really complex experiences, and we need all the language and tools we can get. So if I'm using different terms than the ones you're used to, that doesn't necessarily mean that any of them are wrong. Generally, I avoid using clinical language because I think it's not very accessible or humanizing. Again, for full disclosure, I'm not a therapist or a clinician or a counselor. I provide education and consulting services related to trauma, but not mental health treatment. If you want more info on my background, you can find that at TraumaRoot.com, and I'll also share more crisis resources at the end. I have a lot of personal and professional experience with trauma, but when Suzanne asked me to be here, the first thing I said was, oh, I'm the wrong person for this. I don't know much at all about adoption. And she said, well, we'll have a room full of people who know lots about adoption. What we need is someone who knows lots about trauma. So I'm going to talk about trauma generally, but I don't want to misrepresent myself as someone with adoption expertise. About 10 years ago was when I first realized that trauma was what I was dealing with when I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I was really relieved and encouraged to have a name for that experience. So I set out to learn everything I could about trauma. But everything I found was either overwhelming, discouraging, dehumanizing, or just not meant for me. So I didn't find what I was looking for, and I decided to create it for myself and for others. And that's the foundation of what I'm sharing with you today. Talking about trauma can be really draining, but I still hope that you might leave this session feeling better, not worse. So please do whatever you need to do to get comfortable. I'll invite you to do a brief optional grounding activity before we get into the content. These are a few suggestions, and you can just do whatever feels comfortable for you. So take a series of deep breaths. If you're near a window, look outside, take a drink of water. Notice the temperature in the room and adjust however you need to. Roll your shoulders back to release any tension that might be there. Wiggle around in your seat to get more comfortable, or find something to fidget or doodle with if that helps you. So we'll start by looking at a definition of trauma. There are lots available. This is the one I'd like to use. Trauma is an event or environment that changes our senses of safety, control, and humanity or identity, and has lasting effects on our brain, body, and behavior. So another way to think of trauma is something bad happened to me or around me. I was unable to stop it from happening, and now I feel different from before or different from other people. Sometimes our idea of trauma is limited to single events like an incident of gun violence or a wildfire or the loss of a loved one, but trauma frequently comes from the environment that we're living in. And trauma can sometimes be harder to recognize when it's the result of an ongoing environment instead of a single event. So imagine a beach where there's been a hurricane and the rain and wind have washed away a large part of the coast overnight. Now imagine a different beach where over many years the soil and sand have slowly washed away. Even though the circumstances are very different, the impact of both are significant. And over time, the impact of the slow erosion can be greater than the immediate impact of the hurricane. Next, we have our senses of safety, control, and humanity or identity. Control here is not about control over everything, but control over our own lives, our agency, our autonomy, the power to make decisions for ourselves, to be safe and cultivate joy and growth. So we all know what safe and unsafe feel like and what being in control or out of control feel like, but those aren't universal feelings. So what makes you feel safe or in control may be very different from what makes me feel those things. Safety and control are also not absolute feelings. So at any given moment, we feel some degree of unsafe and some degree of out of control. But trauma moves us from tolerable levels of those feelings to intolerable or overwhelming levels. In short, a traumatic experience is physically, mentally, or emotionally unbearable. You know, when you put a pot in the sink to fill it up with water and you get distracted for a second, and then when you come back, it's overflowing. Sometimes that's how I think about trauma. Sometimes our capacity to hold stress or overwhelm is a big pot, and sometimes it's a smaller pot. But whatever our capacity is in that moment, what makes an experience traumatic is that it's more than we can hold. It overflows. We'll talk about this more later when we get into resilience, but our capacity to hold pain or overwhelming feelings is not about how strong we are or how strong we want to be. Our capacity is a really complex result of a lot of different factors, both within us and outside of us. Sorry, I went too fast. A change in our sense of identity or humanity is a little more complex, and that's really at the heart of what sets trauma apart from other kinds of stress or overwhelm. A changed sense of humanity could be really literal. For example, if we came close to experiencing death or serious injury, or watching that happen to someone else. A changed sense of identity could also mean that the trauma left us feeling like a different person than we used to be. It could also mean that we feel rejected from other people or fundamentally different from other people, especially if the trauma is interpersonal, if it's inflicted on us by another person, group, or institution. Trauma also frequently causes feelings of guilt and shame, and those two words get used interchangeably a lot, but they're a little bit different. Guilt is when we feel bad about something that we've done, like a particular choice or action or behavior, and shame is when we feel bad about who we are. And both of these are really common after trauma. So when other people respond to our trauma by blaming us or saying, why didn't you do this or that? Or why did you respond this way? It can reinforce our idea that somehow the trauma was our fault, or worse, that the trauma happened because there's something fundamentally wrong with us. And if it feels like there's something fundamentally wrong with us, we feel like it's going to happen again. We all have a fundamental human need for connection, and trauma can make that need a lot harder to meet. So when we say trauma changes our sense of humanity or identity, that's part of what I mean. You might have noticed that this definition doesn't just say safety, control, and humanity, but our senses of these things. And that's because trauma is an individual experience. So let's say my friends and I are in a car accident. I might experience it as traumatic while they do not, for different reasons. What makes something traumatic is not the event or environment itself, but how our brains and bodies process the experience. It's our experience and perception that makes something traumatic, and the response that follows that makes it traumatic. And last, we have lasting impact on brain, body, and behavior. We'll talk about each of these more in depth later, but for now, here are a few examples. In our brain, trauma can affect our memory, focus, learning, and decision-making. In our body, trauma can affect our physical health, our body awareness, and our reactions to sensory information like smells, sounds, tastes. And in our behavior, trauma can affect how we react to new environments or information, how we want to spend our time, and how we communicate or connect with other people. When professionals in the mental health field talk about being trauma-informed, they frequently say that they're trying to change the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And the idea is that we need to stop blaming people or misdiagnosing them for their very normal reactions to trauma. Resmaa Menakem is a trauma scholar and educator who says we need to take that one step further and also ask what happened to your community and what's still happening. And these additional questions allow us to recognize not just traumatic events that happened in the past, but traumatic environments that are ongoing. They also push us to recognize the ways that systems and institutions perpetuate trauma against entire communities. Dr. Sean Ginwright is another thought leader and professor who pushes us to hold those questions in larger context. He talks about like trauma isn't the only part of us that matters. We are more than our trauma. That's one part of our identity, not our whole identity. Frequently, when we hear examples of trauma, it's the same sexual assault, family violence, natural disasters. But I think we don't talk enough about one of the most common and impactful forms of trauma, which is identity-based trauma. So you might hear identity-based trauma and think, okay, trauma we experience because of who we are. But identity-based trauma is not just about who we are, it's trauma we experience when others have social power over us because of who we are or who they think we are. Identity-based trauma happens when it's not safe for us to be ourselves. We feel forced to hide or change or deny who we are in order to be safe or to exist at all. Identity-based trauma is both person to person and embedded in cultures and systems. So some examples of people who experience identity-based trauma in the US include Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people who are disabled, LGBTQ, chronically ill, undocumented, poor, neurodivergent, fat, and non-Christian. There are more examples than are listed here, and each of these oppressions is different, and some of these oppressions are much more pervasive and impactful than others. Of course, many adoptees, first birth parents, and adoptive parents experience trauma related to adoption, including identity-based trauma. There are a lot of different ways that can happen, including not having access to parts of our identity or feeling like part of our identity has been disrupted or ignored. Too often when we talk about trauma, we remove the person or group or system that causes the trauma from the conversation. And when we don't name the cause of the trauma, we start to see individuals or communities who experience it as though there's something inherently wrong with them. We think, oh, this person is hurt, this person needs help, and we don't think, oh, someone or something hurt or neglected this person, that someone or system should be held accountable. And we get stuck on the idea of helping after something bad happened, and we're not thinking about why it happened and how to keep it from happening again. We all have multiple identities, and most of us have a combination of oppressed and privileged identities. And not all oppressed or privileged identities are equally oppressed or privileged. For example, I'm autistic, queer, and non-binary, and I have a chronic illness, but the level of safety and access I experience every day is shaped mostly by my whiteness. For our oppressed identities, addressing identity-based trauma in ourselves can look like finding spaces or people who make us feel safe, who affirm us for who we are. It can look like finding ways to recognize the parts of ourselves that we've had to hide or abandon or change in order to feel safe and accepted by other people, and then trying to reconnect with those parts of ourselves and embrace them as much as we can. For our privileged identities, addressing identity-based trauma can look like examining our privileges and asking ourselves, what have I accepted as normal or standard because it's simply designed for someone like me or because it benefits me? What access do I have that others don't, and how can I work to make sure that everyone has access? You might have heard people say, don't compare traumas, but I think that comparing our experiences can be either harmful or helpful depending on how we do it. I think we have to ask ourselves why we're comparing traumas or experiences, and it's usually one of two reasons. We're either using it to shut down someone who's trying to talk about their experience, or we're trying to use it to learn about someone else's experience. So when we find ourselves comparing our trauma to someone else, consider, am I trying to use one to cancel out the other or invalidate the other? Or am I trying to hold and understand both? So what does all that mean for us when we're trying to support other people through trauma? Looking for common ground can be really helpful, but don't force it if it's not there. So saying something like, I understand what you're going through, seems like a really supportive thing to say, but it could also be pretty harmful if we're making assumptions about someone else's experience or comparing it to our own when it's very different. Just because we're here to help, either as a loved one or a professional, that doesn't mean that we're universally equipped to understand or relate to someone else's experience. We can't always relate or understand, but we can always choose to believe someone when they tell us about their experience. We can reassure them that their feelings and perceptions are valid and real, and do our best to help them get what they need, even if it's very different from what we think we would need in that situation. An important part of understanding trauma is recognizing that even when we have experienced trauma ourselves, other people have vastly different experiences and responses to their trauma. So trust people when they tell you what they're going through, even if it doesn't make sense to you why they would feel or react that way. And the more privileges we hold, the more work we have to do to examine our behavior and unlearn the assumptions or judgments that we make. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to look at a few common myths and misunderstandings about trauma. Trauma is not rare, it's super common. Various official stats say something like 70% of adults will experience trauma in their lifetime, but those numbers mostly account for events, not environments, so the real number is likely higher. One reason we might not recognize our trauma as trauma is that it's an experience or a process and not always just a moment. Sometimes we think, oh, if I had trauma, I would know, but that's usually because we're thinking about it like the hurricane and not like the erosion. Another reason we might not recognize our trauma is if our regular everyday environment has been traumatic and that's all we've ever known, then it doesn't feel like a life-altering experience because it's not new or out of the ordinary. Even if it's terrible, it's familiar. This is especially common with childhood trauma and identity-based trauma. Not recognizing our trauma can be harmful if it keeps us from healing, but it's not always a bad thing. It might mean that we've developed ways to cope and heal along the way. It could also be an act of self-protection because it can be really scary and overwhelming to identify and name our painful experiences. There are a lot of different ways we differentiate between different levels or types of trauma. There are a lot of different ways to look at it, but basically trauma becomes more or less impactful depending on a few things. The intensity of the experience, how long it lasted, if we were young or like in developmental stages when it happened, how much support we had to deal with it, and the level of other stress or overwhelm we had outside of that traumatic experience. Sometimes we hear trauma and PTSD used as if they're the same, but trauma is an experience and PTSD is a diagnosis. There are actually several different diagnoses related to trauma. I don't know if you're familiar, the DSM-5 is like the official guide to all mental health conditions, and it's enormous. It's a phone book. And I heard somewhere, if we really understood trauma, the DSM would only be 5 pages long. And that's an exaggeration, of course, but the idea is that trauma is at the root of so many mental and physical health conditions, but we're still learning what that looks like. The DSM is like pretty problematic. It's deeply inequitable. So if you get a diagnosis that feels like, yes, thank you, this explains so much, then that's great. Use it and run with it. But that's not happening for everyone. I hope that you and the people you care about find physicians and mental health providers who understand your experience and trust your perceptions. But if you don't, that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're talking about. Above all, trust what your body is telling you. Also, if you're supporting someone who has different identities and privileges than you, remember that many of us have very good reasons for not being able to fully trust that the healthcare system will give us the care we need and deserve. You've probably heard this before, time heals all wounds. There are lots of ways to recover from trauma, but time alone is not one of them. Trauma is not just a bad day that you get over or forget about after a while. It echoes. There are lots of different ways to process it, but we have to address it and not just wait it out for healing to happen. We often hear trauma discussed as a mental health issue, which of course it is, but trauma is a body-based experience, not just a brain-based experience. So even if the trauma itself, like verbal abuse, involved no physical injury or danger, it still affects us physically and not just mentally. So sometimes it's helpful to talk about the brain and body as distinct parts, but of course they're very much connected, and it's important to look at the whole and not just the parts. I'm sure you've heard this too, kids are resilient. Yes and no. Trauma impacts children differently than adults, but that doesn't mean that children are immune to it. The idea that kids are resilient kind of perpetuates a myth that children are unaffected by trauma just because they're too young to remember it or understand it or have the language to talk about it. But our bodies remember and process the trauma, even if our brains don't hold that memory. So compared to adults, there are some qualities of childhood that make kids more vulnerable to trauma and some qualities of childhood that make kids more resilient. Lastly, trauma symptoms are not universal. Trauma appears differently person to person, and trauma responses frequently come in opposite pairs, like sleeping or eating much more or much less than before, having really intense emotions or feeling emotionally numb. And a person's trauma responses can change over time, so the same person can have completely opposite responses at different times. So to understand trauma, we have to understand how the brain and body communicate with each other. So different parts of our brain and body have different functions, and in some ways, like different settings. So depending on what's happening around us, different parts of our brain and body are in control, and that affects how we think, feel, and behave. So our brains are super complex organs, and there's still so much we don't know. So this is a very, very basic, simplified brain model for our purposes. This is called the hand model of the brain. Follow along with me if you're into that. If not, that's fine too. So if you hold your hand up like this, down here is your wrist area is your hindbrain. Your thumb is your midbrain, and we're gonna fold that over our palm, and then your forefingers on the top are your front brain. So hindbrain, midbrain, front brain, if that helps. So when we're in our when we're feeling safe and when we're feeling safe, our front brain is in control, and this part of our brain allows for problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, imagination, curiosity, learning. That's the most advanced thinking that our brain does, but it only happens when we feel safe. Our midbrain and our front brain is really good at responding carefully and specifically, but not very good at responding quickly. Our midbrain is kind of the opposite. It's good at responding quickly, but not very good at responding carefully or specifically. So our midbrain kicks in with our fight-flight response when we feel threatened or overwhelmed. We're still able to take action, but we are making more like black and white decisions instead of full spectrum of color. So we don't really, this part of our brain, again, acts quickly, but doesn't always make the best possible decisions because we are trying to respond quickly, if that makes sense. And then the hindbrain is good at keeping us alive in a kind of break glass in case of emergency way, but it's not great at responding to our environment. And we usually hear about fight flight, but there's also two other survival responses called freeze, or the fourth one's called like 8 different things. I like flow, as in go with the flow. And that one's really common, again, with childhood trauma or identity-based trauma. So when our hindbrain is in control, we're not very active. We feel super overwhelmed. We might not be responsive, like verbally or with facial expressions. That's kind of the more extreme version. The less extreme version would be like maybe saying yes to something without really wanting to, or just like feeling pressure to do what's expected of you, or do what everyone else around you is doing, or just do what's easiest, like the easiest forward motion. And that's an attempt to just kind of blend in and stay safe. I usually explain that better. I'm going to pause and see if anyone has questions on that. Again, put them in the chat or take yourself off mute. In the meantime, I'll say, so these are 3 like general categories, but think of this more like a spectrum than just 3 settings. So like you can be somewhere between these stages. You may have heard of something called like regulating your nervous system, or being dysregulated when you're upset. So regulated means that we're up top here in front brain, and dysregulated means we're in midbrain or hindbrain. So you're not just regulated or dysregulated like a light switch. You can be a little more or less regulated than you were a moment before, more like a dimmer switch, if that makes sense. Okay, I'll stop talking and see if there's any questions.
I don't see anything in the chat right now.
Okay.
So you can
Move on. Okay. Great. So generally our behavioral responses to trauma fall into 3 categories: avoidance, hypervigilance, and re-experiencing. So avoidance, as you might guess, could be deciding to avoid things. It might look like avoiding things without really knowing that that's what we're doing. Hypervigilance can look like being constantly on alert, jumpy, restless, struggling to focus or remember, or being extra sensitive to sensory information. Like if someone knocks on the door suddenly, you're more likely to like jump out of your seat than just casually turn around. And re-experiencing can look like nightmares or flashbacks. It could also be more subtle, like zoning out, losing track of time because your mind is somewhere else. Or it could also look like kind of when you're interacting with someone else, kind of reenacting some of the dynamics that happened during the traumatic experience, because in our mind we're still there. You might have heard the term behavioral health. I just want to note something about that. Sometimes as caregivers or loved ones or practitioners, we focus too much on how someone's mental health challenges affect us or affect the people around them, and not enough on how the individual's experience affects them, the individual. So our behavior is just one part about how we're feeling. So if my caregiver or doctor or therapist is only addressing the parts of my experience that bother the people around me, or the outward parts that they can see, that's not enough. When the people around us aren't trying to see or understand our whole selves, then we get pushed into masking or code switching, or otherwise like hiding our pain out of fear or exhaustion. And the last point I want to make on this slide, I think is most important. So as humans, we have limited amounts of energy, right? We can push ourselves and stretch our limits, but at some point we need a nap or a banana or a hug. We can only do so much. And our brain and body's first priority is always survival. So when there's no danger or trauma present, we can spend a little bit of energy staying aware of our environment and being safe, and spend most of our energy enjoying our lives. But during or after trauma, our brain and body are working extra hard to protect us, and it's physically and mentally exhausting. So the more energy we spend protecting our life, the less we have to spend participating in life. So if you've experienced trauma, or you know someone who has, you know that we sometimes withdraw from things, even things that are really important to us, things that we enjoy, because we just don't have the energy for them anymore. And to an outsider, it might look like laziness or negativity or giving up, but that's really not what's happening at all. We're just spending more of our limited energy on survival, even if that's not obvious to us or the people around us. I'm sure you've heard the word trigger before, but it sometimes gets conflated or misused. So a trigger is just any reminder of trauma that sparks a trauma reaction. So it could be sensory, like a sound or smell or taste. It could be an emotion or a thought, a person, a place, really any reminder. And a trauma reaction is a self-protective behavior that might look or feel out of place because we're responding to danger that's not actually there. So let's say if I survived a fire in my apartment building, I might be triggered by my roommate's alarm clock or the sound of a delivery truck backing up because the beeping sounds like a smoke alarm. Or I might feel restless at a barbecue because the smell of smoke is telling my body that there's something wrong. And a trauma reaction would be something like anxiety or sweating or a fast heartbeat when those things happen. So when something triggers us, our trauma reaction is not based on a decision we made, it's a natural reflex. So if you're at home and there's a sudden loud knock on your door and you jump, it's not that you've decided to be startled, your body is just reacting to new information that it thinks might be dangerous. We know that our brains react quickly to help our bodies respond to the world around us. But if we stop to think about every reaction we have, we can't quite react fast enough to protect ourselves. So if I step into the crosswalk and a car is running a red light, I don't have time to stand there and think. I have to jump out of the way immediately. So when we're in danger, we don't have enough time to take in all the information around us, process it, and then react. So instead of waiting for all the information, our brains and bodies react to potential danger or possible danger and not just real or confirmed danger. So our brains aren't trying to recognize a threat, they're trying to predict one. So let's say I have an ex-partner who was abusive, who yelled at me a lot. Even after I've gotten out of that relationship, I might get really anxious, not only when I hear yelling, but when I hear any loud noise. Maybe it's the crowd at a concert or car horns outside my window. Even though my front brain knows that I'm safe and fine, my midbrain and hindbrain are still connecting loud noises with very real danger. So my body's reacting to protect me. Triggers can be fully conscious, semi-conscious, or subconscious. So that means I might know exactly what triggered me and why. I might have no idea what triggered me or why, or somewhere in between, right? And triggers can be especially disorienting when we don't know what's happening, because it's like we hear an alarm that no one else hears and we don't know how to turn it off. But the sound is not any less annoying just because we don't know where it's coming from. But even when we've like learned about our trauma and our triggers and our trauma reactions, even when we know exactly what's happening and why, trauma reactions are still really upsetting and disorienting. Because our brains and bodies are sending us like conflicting information, right? So I know logically that I'm safe and fine, but my body is still having all these reactions, and it can cause a lot of self-doubt, and it's hard to know how to help yourself. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, 1 second. It's not letting me go back. Okay. So glimmers are sort of the opposite of triggers. And I don't know if there's a whole bunch of science or even any science about glimmers yet, but I think the concept can still be helpful when we're recovering from trauma. So I want to share it anyway. If we can think of a trigger as a spark of danger or fear or overwhelm, we can think of a glimmer as a spark of comfort or joy or safety. So when we're in the process of helping our brain and body become less reactive to potential danger, glimmers can help us reorient ourselves toward things that make us feel safe and soothe our nervous system. So glimmers, again, can be just anything that gives you an overwhelming sense of calm. So any activity that you do that you can completely lose yourself in. Sensory memories are also good glimmers because that sensory information helps to soothe our nervous system. As examples, some of mine would be the feeling I get when I cook something, and someone wanders into the kitchen and asks what smells so good, or the way my dog can't sit still when I get home because she's so excited to see me. I think the most universal one I can think of is when you walk into your best friend's house or your favorite relative, and this, or if you're lucky, your own home, and the smell of the home is so familiar and just washes over you. That's not just like you feel that in your body. That's not just a nice thought. It can be overwhelming. So So that's a good place to start when we're thinking about glimmers. So when we're recovering from trauma, two main things need to happen: coping and healing. Coping is a practice or perspective that we use to improve our sense of safety, control, and humanity or identity. And healing is a process of repairing, restoring, or reimagining ourselves after trauma. Coping addresses the pain that we feel in the moment, and healing addresses the root cause of the pain. So using a physical health example, coping would be like taking a painkiller, and healing is like getting an X-ray and a cast. Judith Herman is another trauma scholar who named 3 elements of recovery: establishing safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. So establishing safety could look like getting out of an unsafe situation, if that's possible, but it can also look like creating a safe or comforting space within a generally unsafe environment. Remembrance and mourning can look like acknowledging what happened and feeling more in control of that story, acknowledging what was lost. And reconnection can look like reconnection to ourselves, to our identity, connection to other people, and to our sense of our future. Sometimes we talk about coping like it's the short-term solution and healing is the long-term solution, because in the beginning, we're not ready to heal, right? All we can do is cope. But actually, coping is useful across our entire process of recovery and even after it. It's not just useful for trauma, but also for everyday stress. We're all coping all the time. We're just not necessarily thinking of it that way. So coping is not just what happens after a hard day, but we can also do it in a kind of preventative way to kind of prop ourselves up. So the next time we have a bad day, it doesn't hit us quite so hard. I'm going to mix my metaphors here, so sorry. Try not to think of coping like a pair of crutches that you use when you break your ankle and then try to get rid of as soon as possible because they're a hassle. Think of coping like a set of tools that you gather that are useful not just now, but also in the future. Oops, sorry. I'm so sorry. So self-care is important and empowering. We should all be taking care of ourselves. But I think self-care is frequently, conversations about self-care are frequently a missed opportunity to talk about community care. The dominant culture of the US puts, I believe, way too much responsibility on us as individuals to meet all of our own needs. I think we have to, self-care is important, but also self-care alone is not enough to keep any of us afloat. We have to take care of each other. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this slide, it's this: self-care is not so much about the activity, it's about the perspective. And by that, I mean, it doesn't really matter what you do for self-care. As long as you're not harming anyone else, do whatever you want and call it self-care. Because what makes it self-care is not the thing you're doing, but the story that you're telling yourself while you're doing it, and the way that story changes how our brain and body work. So when we're overwhelmed, the story in our heads is, I don't know what I'm going to do. I feel trapped in this situation. Something outside of me has to change because I can't go on like this. But when we do something, even a small thing to take care of ourselves, and that thing helps us feel better, we're changing that story to, I'm overwhelmed, but I know something I can do about it. I feel stuck, but not entirely trapped. I hope that things change for the better, but in the meantime, I know there are some things I can do for myself. Lastly, a self-care routine doesn't always feel possible, and that's okay. But if we're doing something for ourselves on a regular, predictable basis, it's not just helping us change that story in our heads in the moment that we're doing the thing. It helps us change that story every time we think about it. So back before streaming services, when we had to wait a week for the new episode of whatever, it didn't just make me happy while I was watching it. It made me happy every time I thought, oh, my show's in a couple days. Oh, my show's tomorrow. My show is tonight. In the same way, a self-care routine like gives you that kind of constant like burst of joy or whatever, that reminder like good things are on the way. Like there are good things to look forward to. Sorry, I did it again. Oh, I may have deleted a slide. It's fine. So usually when we think about coping, we're taught to pursue healthy coping and avoid unhealthy coping, right? but what's healthy or unhealthy is extremely relative from person to person and also moment to moment. So is a salad of leafy green vegetables healthy? Absolutely. If I have an upset stomach, should I be eating a salad of leafy green vegetables? Absolutely not. I need rice or banana or something that's gentle on my stomach, right? So in the same way, after trauma, what's healthy might look different than what we think. Sometimes what's healthy after trauma is seeking comfort and care and being gentle and patient with ourselves. Everything we do to cope is an attempt to meet a need. And during or after trauma, we're trying to make the best out of an impossible situation. And we can't make ideal decisions because our environment is so far from ideal. So when we think about coping or healthy coping or holding ourselves to this impossible standard, we're doing more harm than good. We have to kind of adjust our expectations of ourselves because we've been through something. So instead of thinking about healthy or unhealthy coping, I want you to try to think of it in terms of adaptive or maladaptive. So adaptive is doing more for me than to me. So overall reducing harm. And maladaptive is doing more to me than for me or causing harm. So again, when we're experiencing trauma, we're doing the best we can to survive, right? And we shouldn't judge ourselves or each other for what we do in the name of survival. But when we have more support and when we have more capacity to process that traumatic experience, it's time to examine how we cope and say, is this still working for me, or am I holding on to this because it's familiar? Like, can I challenge myself to try to cope in a new way or an additional way? And again, everything we do to cope is an attempt to meet a need. So one place to start, if we're looking for new coping skills or different ones, is to say, like, what am I getting out of this experience? Like, it must be doing something for me if I'm still reaching for it. So like, what need is this satisfying? And what are some new or different ways that I could meet that need? The one exception to this is we can't just think about what it's doing to or for us. We also have to think about what it might be doing to others. So whatever we do to cope, we're not obligated to try to like help other people with our coping, but we do have a responsibility to make sure that we're not harming other people in the ways that we cope. Oop. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to take a moment. So we're going to look at a few categories of coping activities with examples, so you can think about what might make sense for you. Think of this as a menu, not a to-do list. Everyone's coping looks different, so don't let someone else's define yours for you. Also, the purpose of coping activities is not to like mute our feelings entirely. The goal is to turn the volume down so we can feel them while also feeling more safe. So you remember earlier, we talked about regulating our nervous system and getting back up to front brain. When we're trying to regulate or move our way back up, something most of us do is like self-talk in our head, like, you're okay, this is gonna be all right, I'm gonna get through this, I'm sort of prepared, it'll probably be fine. And sometimes that works and sometimes that absolutely does not work. So that's using our like brain information to try to communicate to our body, stop sweating, stop shaking, like calm down, you're fine, right? But when we can't think our way out, we can try to feel our way out. And that involves using body information to try to communicate with our brain. And the way our bodies work is we actually have more capacity to use body information to communicate to our brain than the other way around. So some of these activities feel like, I feel like I'm about to die. You're really telling me to like light a scented candle and you'll be fine? No. But when we use sensory information, sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, that information is actually incredibly powerful and soothing our nervous system. When the like smoke alarm in our brain is going off saying something's wrong, sensory information can be the fastest and easiest way to tell our brain, like, nothing's on fire, I just burned toast, if that makes sense. All right. So zooming in and zooming out. This is something I came up with when I was working in disaster response. I was just stuck in the same room all day, trying to support people and hearing story after story and feeling like I didn't think about anything else. All I thought about was this horrible event and all these horrible experiences that these people had to endure. And it was really overwhelming, obviously. And after a while, I started forcing myself to go outside for 5 or 15 minutes, whatever I could a day. And I would text or call a friend and say, tell me what you had for dinner last night. Tell me what you're doing this weekend. Tell me the funny thing your kid did last week. Talk to me about anything that isn't this. Like, help me put this experience in context and remember that what's happening deserves attention, but it is not the only thing going on. Help me think about it differently. And then zooming in is kind of the opposite. When zooming out is too overwhelming, zooming in can look like build a pillow fort with your kids and get in it with them and let that be your whole world for a while. Or turn off all your notifications and play Candy Crush for 15 minutes and let that be your whole world for a while. It's not about avoiding thinking about it, but giving our brain and body a chance to rest and recover. Like, we can't just focus on our trauma all of the time when it feels like it's trying to take up all of our brain space. We have to make space for something else. There are a couple more of these. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to skip ahead because I'm taking too long. So I want to talk a little bit about healing. So if trauma changes our senses of safety, control, and humanity or identity, then healing from trauma means restoring or reimagining those things. None of these things are predictable. They're different from each of us. But here's some things that I wish I had known 10 years ago or more. Healing is a long and nonlinear process. It takes a while and it's messy. It's also, again, more of a spectrum than a binary. Like, we're not healed or not healed. It's absolutely possible to feel and be more healed than we were yesterday, last month, last year. So when we think of it as a process or a spectrum more than a binary, that's really helpful. The first step is to build awareness about how our trauma has affected us. And from there, we can identify, okay, what do I need to deal with it? And what can I do for myself? And what do I need help with? A big part of healing is rebuilding trust with ourselves. Again, when we have these trauma reactions and our brain is telling us, parts of our brain are telling us one thing and parts of our brain are telling us another thing. Am I safe? Am I unsafe? And we just get stuck in that infinite loop of, am I okay? Building up that trust in ourselves and our perceptions and decisions is really important. So it's really important to have people around us who trust and validate our perceptions, even if they don't understand them, and reassure us that whatever we're feeling is valid. Sometimes I think of trauma recovery as a long rope with a bunch of knots in it. So the length of the rope is our capacity to function and enjoy our lives, and trauma can tie knots in that rope, right, and make it shorter. But recovering from trauma doesn't have to look like untying all those knots at once, or even untying all the knots ever. Untying even one knot can make things easier. And even when we can't untie a knot completely, even loosening it up can make the rope longer or give us more wiggle room with the others. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about resilience. I encourage you to Google resilience if you have time to kill, because the thing that comes up is like the 3 elements of resilience, the 4, the 5, the 7, the 18 elements of resilience. So what I know from that is there are lots of different ways to think about it. So this is the one I use. I think it's a good jumping off point, but I encourage you to think about it in any way that's helpful for you. So I think, however we think about resilience, it should involve at least these 3 elements: our disposition, our self-care, and our community care. So our disposition is, okay, well, sorry. So this is a kid's game called Kerplunk that I like to use to illustrate resilience. In this game, you're trying to keep as many marbles as you can on top and these interwoven sticks help to support the marbles. So these interwoven sticks are the elements of resilience, disposition, self-care, and community care. And the marbles on top are all the things we need to do or want to do as a person. So disposition is something we're born with that also evolves over time. So I think of it as like the personality of our nervous system. So in the same way your personality shapes how you'd behave at a party, your disposition shapes how you might react to potential trauma. So if someone's yelling at me, my disposition would help to determine whether I'm more likely to cry, yell back, walk away, or feel numb. So again, we're all born with a certain disposition. Like some babies are more fussy, some babies are more chill and can be passed around the room and are, sort of fine with it. But our disposition also evolves over time. So all of our experiences that teach us what's safe and what's not safe affect our disposition. So if I've learned that speaking up for myself or challenging authority gets me in more trouble, then makes me less safe, then my disposition over time is going to change to make me like more submissive in the face of danger as opposed to reactive, because that's what's kept me safe before. So that's what my brain and body reach for again. That makes sense. Self-care and community care are pretty self-explanatory. Again, self-care are the ways that we have learned to take care of ourselves and manage adversity, our abilities, strengths, etc. Community care is, I feel like, the one that gets overlooked the most. When we talk about resilience, we usually talk about it like it's like a character quality, like it's something we've just decided to have by sheer force of will. But it's a lot easier to be resilient when you have a lot of support. And it's a lot harder to be resilient when you don't have a lot of support. And that sounds really obvious, but I feel like that gets left out of a lot of conversations. If I'm worried about money or my housing or my job or childcare or any of these things, that's going to make it a lot more difficult to be resilient. So here are a few ways to support others through trauma recovery. Sorry, this is usually a 2-hour presentation. I'm trying to, I think I'm mostly back on track now. So
we also definitely want to try and see if people have some questions
right.
before we wrap things up. So
okay.
I don't know how much more you have. You want to wrap things up?
This is the last one.
Okay, go
for it. Is that all right? Okay.
No, it's great. It's great. I just want to see if people have questions. I just want to get to it.
Of course. So again, if trauma changes our senses of safety, control, and humanity or identity, then the best thing we can do for others is help support restoring or reimagining those. So the way I like to think about that is asking someone, what would make you feel more safe? What would make you feel more in control? What would make you feel more like yourself? And what would make you feel more connected to other people? Again, recognizing our limitations and privileges. Sometimes we so desperately want to give someone what they need or be helpful that we forget that like wanting to help is not always the same as being able to help. So really supporting someone means being okay with it if what they need is not something that you can offer, or they need something more than you can offer. That's not about you, that's about them, and that's okay. So be curious about how you can be helpful, but also don't take it personally if what they need is something that they can't find with you. Also, we talk a lot about not being judgmental, which is absolutely true and great, but we don't talk enough about what should come instead. And that's validation and curiosity. So let them know that it's okay to feel how they feel, whatever that is, even if it's different than how we think we would feel, and be curious about what they need rather than telling them what we think they should do or what we think they should need. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Evy, that was so fantastic. And so resonant with adoption trauma to me anyway. And from the comments, I think other people as well. So does anyone have any questions for Evy? Or
hold on.
Okay,
Oh, how do I unmute?
I can stop sharing now.
does Barbara have a question? Barbara Montgomery, do you have a question?
Oh, no, I'm just enthralled with everything.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been amazing. Thank you.
I'm glad.
I have a question.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Evie. This was really wonderful. I super appreciated the accessibility of this. So I'm sure there's actually quite a few people here who either lead support groups or run various organizations or groups. And my question is around how we use trigger warnings. And I have more recently been thinking a lot about and really contemplating what that means to use a trigger warning. The way I've seen it played out, I haven't seen anyone use it in a way that I feel is really accessible to the audience. So meaning like trigger warning, and then like within less than a second, they're rambling on what the thing is that's going to activate everyone, right? And as opposed to sexual, this is going to be a sexual trigger warning, or I don't know what other kinds of warnings there might be. But anyway, my question is do you have any tips or tricks or some kind of tool that can both offer an actual like trigger warning, and this is going to be about sexual violence, so if you want to turn your camera off or turn this on a mute or something like that? I don't know. I haven't seen anybody do it well, and so I'm curious.
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answers, but here's what I know. Some of the things I've seen done well are saying content warning instead of trigger warning, because literally anything could be a trigger, and we have to give people that space as much as possible. Think about those content warnings beforehand, and talk and like give those warnings before the group meets or at the very beginning of the group session, and also follow that up with, if you are making the choice to like dip out of that conversation or avoid hearing or seeing that, here's what you can do. So you give people options ahead of time and they don't panic and think, well, how do I get out of this? Normalize that at the beginning of the session, so it seems like a valid option for everyone and not like a personal choice that person has to make, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But you were talking about like group therapy sessions. Is that?
No, I'm just thinking about how many workshops I've been in and how many conferences and how many various things where I hear that, but then
Right.
when the way it's being played out makes actually zero sense to me.
Yeah. So I think, just giving people lead time and make clear what the options are. And and also being really careful with your language about like making sure not to judge people for taking that option. Sometimes we feel proud of ourselves for giving the option, but when it's very clear with our language what the acceptable and not acceptable options are, then that kind of undoes the good we're trying to do.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Does anyone have any more questions or comments? You can unmute. We're very shy this Friday. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
Peter, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to follow on with those trigger warnings. Sorry, I have a very noisy household here. Can you pick him up, please? Yeah. The trigger warnings. I see a bigger value in trigger warnings as a way of changing the narrative of, especially in adoption. In Australia here, there is a lot of trigger warnings, and I'm Indigenous myself, but there's a lot of trigger warnings whenever there is any content involving Indigenous people. And that's helped to change the narrative of society about those traumas of Indigenous people. And I see a bigger value in that. That helps to spread that word that it is trauma, and some of the subjects talked about are traumatizing. That's all. So I wanted to say on that. I could say a lot more about my traumas. I'm new to this, 4 years in. I found out I was adopted 4 years ago at age 59. So, I haven't lived with, or I have lived with this all my life, but I just didn't realise what the traumas were. All right. Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed your talk amongst all the other interruptions I have going on in this household.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I feel there are burning questions out there. They're just small and smoldering at the moment. So if you could light them up.
Barbara had her hand raised.
Oh, Barbara.
Yeah, hi. So thank you. This was a great talk. I mean, it was so much, I really appreciated it because you know, I got a clear understanding of how the body comes into play with this as well. You know, just being familiar with trauma because, you know, I went to grad school and stuff, but you know, I had a difficult time equating the fact that there was things being held in the body that your body is experiencing, what your mind is like, you can't help it. And the way that you described how it's the reaction that you can't like stop your body basically from doing that. Like it's just going to do it. And so thank you so much for everything that you said in your talk. And I just had a quick question about the term glimmer. That's the first time I've heard it. Now, is that a positive thing, or is it one or both?
It's kind of the opposite of the trigger. So I look at it as a good thing. I suppose it's possible for a glimmer to be negative, but I can't think of an example right now. Really, it's like an overwhelming feel of joy, safety, or calm, in the same way that a trigger is an overwhelming feeling of fear or danger. So I don't think I talked about this much, but when we're in midbrain, our brains are thinking very much in black and white. We're not interested in detail or nuance. It's like good, bad, safe, unsafe. And out of survival, our brain and body wants to focus on danger. Like, I'm not interested in joy or pleasure. Like, we're just zoning in on danger, fear, like everything negative, right? So it's really helpful to learn what our triggers are, so we can either avoid them or learn how to manage them when they come up. But it's also really helpful to learn what our glimmers are so that we can kind of coach or like retrain our brains to orient to safety and joy. Also, sometimes we, as trauma survivors, we feel like we're being really negative, or we think of trauma survivors as being really negative and just focused on everything that's wrong. But that's a survival response. That's not a choice to be a negative person. That's a very normal, natural survival response. So glimmers also help us like reorient our focus to seek safety and joy and not just avoid danger. I hope that helps. And you said you were really interested in like the body responses. My favorite book for that is called The Politics of Trauma, which you wouldn't think would be about trauma in the body, but it is, and it's excellent. It's all about somatics, our body responses, and also social justice. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you for that. And yes, thank you. It was helpful.
So Evy.
Yeah.
Can you tell us
Go ahead.
Can you tell us about your upcoming video series?
Sure. So I had the great privilege to work with an emergency preparedness organization in East Harlem. I've worked with them for several years in the disaster response part, but I'm lucky that they wanted me to do mental health too. So we got to create a short video series. There are 10 videos total. They're in English and Spanish. On the topics are trauma, coping, supporting others, resilience, and something else I'm forgetting. Anyway, my goal with those, they're really short. My goal with those was to keep it at a really accessible reading level. They're fully captioned and animated. So I don't know, personally, when I was first learning about trauma, I had to read medical texts or social work texts, which was hugely overwhelming, and absolutely not for me. When we're dealing with trauma, it can be really hard to learn or process new information. It has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with what our brain is trying to, all the work our brain is trying to do to keep us safe and alive, right? So it can be really hard to process new information. So I wanted to make these videos really, really accessible. I hope I've done that. And Suzanne already shared the link. So yeah, those, I've had both people with personal experience with trauma, but also people who work with trauma professionally respond to them well. So I hope maybe it'll be useful for you or someone you know.
They're really fantastic. If you guys get a chance to check them out, they're about 2-3 minutes long each, and really great information.
Thank you so much.
They pack a punch. They're just boom. They're a little Evy pellet of knowledge.
Yep.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Evy, thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much
being the special guest. You're just amazing.
It was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Evy, I'd also like to thank you for coming on tonight. Your presentation was outstanding. And I can see that this is going to be replayed a lot because it was just chock full of information that resonated with so many of us when you agreed. And I just love the little analogies there. So thank you so much for being a part of this evening. And like I said, I think we will look forward to many replays.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Marcy. We didn't mention you today because we thought you were trying to keep a low profile.
See how that worked out, didn't we?
We're trying to charge you the night off.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we're here.
So I was excited to hear this presentation this evening. So yeah, I had to be. So
wonderful.
guys, I appreciate
It was
you.
great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone for coming
out.
for being here.
Yes, we really greatly appreciate it.
And thank you, Marcy, for having us.
Yes.
For tolerating us.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Welcome.
We are doing it. We're doing it right now.
We're getting so
next week.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
First of all, the happy hour is taking to the later hours of the night. It's going to be at 10 p.m. EST next time. And it's Garen Wade, author of You'll Always Be White to Me, in this special time slot. So it is July 30th, 10 p.m. EST.
10 p.m.
Late night happy hour.
So
Adoption happy hour.
Reset that calendar to 10. It's going to be great. I'm very excited to hear about this.
And we now know that adoption happy hour is community care.
Yes.
We just thought it was fun, but now we have like mental health purposes thanks to Evy.
All right. So
I think Astrid had a question. She was trying to squeeze in.
Oh, That's okay. That's okay. I know we're wrapping up. I was just, if nobody else had a question, but I'm good. I will ask a question though of, is this going to be regularly at the later hour? Or is it just for next week?
It's just for next week.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, Marcy.
You guys are
We're just like,
you guys are so
if
cute.
you want to take
It's
it,
ridiculous.
it's okay. It's just you did want us to do it. It's
at 10 p.m. just on July 30th, and then
Right.
back to regularly scheduled 7 p.m. EST.
Okay.
right.
Awesome. Thank you all for everything that you do. This was
Oh,
wonderful. Thank you. Bye.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Again, it was so wonderful to be here, and we considered it an honor to
Huge
be
honor.
able to guest host.
And
And
very special to have Evy
Evy
on.
on, you were phenomenal. Thank you,
Thank you.
and thank you all.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Evy.
Have a great
Have
evening,
a good-
everybody.
Have
Hey,
a
you
great
too.
weekend.
Thanks,
Take
Evy.
care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Evie, I just wanted to say thank you. I got your notes.
Oh.
It was just simply about Mate, Gabor Mate, and if you've seen his film, and I know he's doing another screening, or they're doing another screening from the 28th to the 1st. And I just wanted to get your input or your feedback on that if you've seen it.
I haven't yet. I've been working on like a contract deadline. I wanted to, but I